Imagine a smoky cafe in the heart of Paris. The year is 1929. Two of the most brilliant students in France are sitting across from each other at a small wooden table. He is Jean-Paul Sartre, short, eccentric, and convinced of his own hideous ugliness. She is Simone de Beauvoir, sharp, elegant, and arguably the most gifted woman of her generation. They are young, they are ambitious, and they are about to sign a contract that will change the course of intellectual history. But it wasn't a marriage contract. In fact, they despised traditional institutions. Instead, they created what they called a pact of freedom. The rules were simple, yet radical. They would be each other's essential love, but they were free to pursue contingent lovers, anyone else they desired. There was only one absolute catch: total transparency. They promised to tell each other every dirty detail, every secret thought, and every intimate moment shared with someone else. For decades, the world worshipped this pact. They were the power couple of the century, the icons of liberation. They told the generation that man is condemned to be free. But behind the glamour of Parisian jazz clubs and intellectual fame, there was a trail of broken lives. These other lovers weren't strangers. They were often their own students, vulnerable teenagers systematically manipulated by Beauvoir and then passed to Sartre like trophies in a game of ego. Today we are performing a psychological autopsy on an existential nightmare. We are moving past the revolutionary philosophy to find a predatory system of control and a shared madness that destroyed dozens of lives. Welcome to Deconstructing Minds. To understand the system they built, we have to look into their shadows. Every philosophy is, in some way, a biography, and the architecture of existentialism was built on deep-seated personal insecurities. Jean-Paul Sartre was a man haunted by a profound inferiority complex. He was barely 5 feet tall, and a childhood illness had left him with a wall eye that made his gaze unnerving. He considered himself physically repulsive. He realized early on that if he couldn't win people over with his face, he would have to do it with his brain. His intellect wasn't just a gift, it was a weapon for total domination. He didn't just want followers, he needed a circle of admirers to feel like a king. Simone de Beauvoir was his perfect psychological mirror. She was brilliant, but she suffered from an insatiable need for intellectual validation. She decided that Sartre's mind was the only one superior to hers, and she tethered her entire identity to his approval. Together, they formed what psychologists call a symbiotic narcissistic bond. He was the genius who provided the light, and she was the architect who managed the shadows. But Beauvoir had a dark side that the history books often gloss over. As a teacher, she began to use her authority to influence her students. She would win their trust, break down their emotional defenses, and then introduce them into Sartre's world. By doing this, she ensured she remained the essential woman in his life, the only one who truly managed his desires. They didn't just share a life, they shared their influence over the vulnerable. They were two hunters who realized that together they could catch far more than they ever could alone. They called it the trios. But for the young women caught in their orbit, it was more like a factory for trauma. This wasn't just free love. It was a cold, industrial system of psychological domination. Take the case of Bianca Lamblin, 17 years old, idealistic and brilliant. She was a student of Simone de Beauvoir, and she worshipped her. Beauvoir began with what psychologists call love bombing. She showered Bianca with attention, made her feel like the most important person in Paris, and invited her into their inner circle. But once the emotional defenses were down, the trap snapped shut. Bianca was introduced into an intimate relationship with Sartre, This was narcissistic triangulation on a professional scale. Sartre and Beauvoir would sit together in private, reading the girl's letters and analysing her psychological flaws like scientists observing a lab rat. Because of their total transparency pact, there was no sacred space for the third person. They shared every detail of her vulnerability, often laughing at the very feelings they had encouraged. And once they were bored, they simply discarded her. Bianca suffered a total mental collapse after being abandoned by both of them simultaneously. To the power couple, she wasn't a human being with a soul. She was just existential fuel, a temporary object used to prove their own freedom and feed their shared ego. Here is the most chilling part of the story. Sartre and Beauvoir used philosophy as a weapon. They took the profound concepts of existentialism and turned them into tools for intellectual gaslighting. When one of their young followers would cry from jealousy or feel used, they had a ready-made label for her. They called it bad faith. In Sartre's world, bad faith meant lying to yourself to avoid the responsibility of freedom. They told these teenagers that jealousy was a bourgeois emotion, a sign of a weak, unliberated mind. If you were hurting, they argued, it was because you weren't authentic enough. This was a masterful form of cognitive manipulation. They made their victims feel ashamed of their own natural human emotions. They taught these women that to be free meant to accept being used and discarded without complaint. They effectively paralyzed their victims' ability to recognize abuse by relabeling it as liberation. In the end, they created a psychological panopticon. The third person was always being watched by the other two. There was no privacy, only the constant judging gaze of the couple. They dismantled their victims' ability to trust their own reality, all in the name of a philosophy that was supposed to set them free. As the years went by, the weight of the lies and the pressure of their public image began to fracture Sartre's mind. He was writing at an inhuman pace, sometimes 20 pages of dense philosophy a day. To keep going, he relied on a terrifying cocktail of substances. His primary fuel was coridrain, a potent mix of aspirin and high-dose amphetamines. At one point, he was taking 20 pills a day, washed down with litres of black coffee, wine, and endless cigarettes. By 1935, his brain finally reached its breaking point. Sartre began to suffer from a persistent, terrifying hallucination. He saw crabs, invisible crustaceans that sat on his shoulders, that scuttled under his bed. He would walk the streets of Paris, swatting at the air, his eyes wide with a very real terror. He was convinced that the universe was filled with these silent, judging creatures that followed his every move. On Deconstructing Minds, we see these crabs as the physical manifestation of his own paranoia. Sartre's entire philosophy was built on the idea of the gaze, the terrifying feeling that when someone looks at you, they turn you into an object. He had spent his life watching and analysing his young followers, turning them into objects for his experiments. Now he felt the universe was doing the same to him. He was the one under the microscope. He had preached that man makes himself, but he had turned himself into a twitching wreck, haunted by monsters that mirrored the real damage he had caused in his personal life. Chapter 6. The Prison of the Liberated. Jean-Paul Sartre died in 1980. Simone de Beauvoir followed him 6 years later. Today, 50,000 people might walk past their shared grave in Paris, seeing them as the ultimate symbols of 20th century freedom. But as we conclude our autopsy, we have to ask the final, most important question. What is freedom without responsibility? Sartre and Beauvoir proved that you can write the most profound books on ethics while treating the people in your own bedroom as disposable fuel for your ego. They were the world's first intellectual influencers. They sold a dream of liberation that was, in reality, a prison of narcissism. They show us a dangerous truth. When you make feelings and authenticity your only gods, you lose the capacity for true empathy. You can love humanity in the abstract while being cold and calculating to the actual human being standing right in front of you. Their Pact of 1929 wasn't a blueprint for love. It was a manual for a shared shadow. They spent their lives trying to escape the judgment of society, only to realize that true freedom isn't the ability to use others, it's the courage to be responsible for them. In the end, perhaps the crabs were right. Someone was always watching, and the truth eventually caught up with the architects of the lie. Whose mind should we deconstruct next? Let us know in the comments, and remember, the deeper you look into the mind, the more you must be prepared for what looks back.